This story is titled, My Kids Cut Me Off After I Divorced. They're cheating mom. Now they're back because I'm doing well financially. Hey everyone, before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. Hey everyone, I've been holding this in for 8 years, and I just need to get it out. I'm using fake names here to keep it anonymous. I was married to my wife Carly for 25 years. I was 50, she was 48, and we've got 2 kids, Zach, 27, male, and Emily, 25, female, who had already moved out and started their own lives. From the outside, we probably looked like one of those solid couples who had life all figured out. But behind the scenes, it was a whole different story. Before we had Zach and Emily, Carly worked as an office manager at a small company. She loved it and was really good at it. But when Zach was born, she decided to step away from her career to stay home and raise the kids. At the time, it felt like the right choice. I was working full-time as an IT support manager, and we figured we'd get by on my income while Carly focused on the kids. I respected her decision, and I thought we were working as a team. For a while, it worked. Carly took on the brunt of the parenting, school drop-offs, helping with homework, everything. I made sure to tell her how much I appreciated her, even if I couldn't always be there to help. But as the kids got older, things started to get tight financially. Raising 2 kids wasn't cheap, and we were down to just one income. Every unexpected expense, a car repair, a school trip, even back-to-school shopping, felt like a mountain to climb. I picked up extra hours whenever I could, sometimes working late nights or weekends just to keep things steady. I hated it. There were days when I'd leave the house before the kids woke up and come home after they were already in bed. Carly would point out how little time I spent with them, and she wasn't wrong, but what was I supposed to do? We needed the money. Even though I was trying, Carly grew more and more resentful. I think a part of her felt trapped. She'd given up her career for the family, and now that Zach and Emily were older, there wasn't much for her to focus on anymore. She'd make little comments about how other families seemed to have figured it out, while we were still just getting by. It stung. I was already feeling like a failure for not providing the life she wanted, and hearing it from her only made it worse. Then things started to change in ways I couldn't ignore. Carly became very particular about her appearance, getting her hair done regularly, buying expensive clothes she didn't really need, and wearing makeup every day, even when she wasn't going anywhere special. She also started going out more frequently, saying she was meeting old friends or attending community events. I didn't question it at first. I thought, maybe she's just trying to find something for herself, and I didn't want to be the guy who stopped her. If she needed that time, I wanted to support her, but after a while it started to feel off. She'd come home late, smelling like a fancy perfume I didn't recognize, and brush it off when I asked where she'd been. Things hit a breaking point one night when she told me she had a book club meeting. It was 8 p.m., and I remember thinking, who has a book club this late? Something about it didn't add up. For the first time in our marriage, I did something I never thought I'd do. I followed her. She left the house dressed nicer than usual, which was already a red flag. I kept my distance, following her car across town until she pulled into the parking lot of a small coffee shop. I parked far enough away that she wouldn't notice me and waited. After about 10 minutes, she walked inside, and I saw her sit down with a guy I didn't recognize. He was maybe mid-40s, a little younger than us, and they were laughing and talking like they were the only 2 people in the world. At first, I told myself it could be innocent. Maybe he was an old friend or someone from one of her volunteer groups. But then they got up, walked out hand in hand, and got into his car. I followed them to a hotel just a few blocks away. They didn't even hesitate. They walked right in together. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, trying to wrap my head around what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to go inside and confront them, but another part of me knew it was pointless. I'd seen enough. When I got home, I packed a bag and left a note on the kitchen counter. I know what you're doing. Don't bother lying. Then I drove to a friend's house and crashed on their couch for the night. The next day, I called a divorce lawyer. When I confronted Carly, she didn't even try to deny it. She just sat there, calm as ever, like she'd been expecting this conversation. When I told her what I'd seen, the coffee shop, the hotel, she nodded and said, "Well, I guess there's no point in lying, is there?" She admitted she'd been seeing Rick for almost a year. He wasn't just some fling. Apparently, Rick was loaded. He owned a few businesses, had a giant house across town, and understood her in ways I never could. Her words, not mine. She didn't try to sugarcoat it. I wasn't happy, she said. Rick makes me feel appreciated. No tears, no begging for forgiveness, nothing. It was like she'd been waiting for me to figure it out so she could finally move on. She listed off her reasons like she was justifying a business decision. She was lonely. She felt like we'd drifted apart. She missed feeling wanted. Then she hit me with, "You've been so focused on work for years. I didn't think you even noticed me anymore." Like that somehow made her sneaking around okay. I just stood there, letting her talk. But inside, I was fuming. She'd traded 25 years of marriage for someone with a bigger bank account, and she wasn't even pretending to regret it. The only time she hesitated was when I said, "I'm filing for divorce." "You're sure about that?" she asked, tilting her head like she was surprised I'd actually follow through. "I'm done," I said. "You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." She didn't argue. She just said, "All right, I guess this is for the best." It was so cold, so calculated, like this was just another step in her plan. Filing for divorce ended up being easier than I thought. I think I'd been mentally done with our marriage for a while. So once I had a reason to leave, I didn't hesitate. The hardest part wasn't leaving Carly. It was knowing I'd have to tell Zach and Emily. They were adults, but this wasn't some small thing I could brush under the rug. I knew it was going to hit them hard. What I didn't expect was just how little support I'd get from the two people I thought would have my back. I decided to tell them separately. I started with Zach, thinking he'd be the more level-headed one. We met at a diner he liked, the kind of place with greasy burgers and coffee that tasted like motor oil. He was sitting there scrolling on his phone when I walked in. I sat down, made some small talk, and then just ripped the Band-Aid off. "I'm divorcing your mom," I said. Zach's face went blank for a second. Then he put his phone down and said, "Why?" "She's been having an affair," I told him, keeping my voice steady. I didn't want to make it sound like I was fishing for sympathy. I saw her with the guy, and she admitted it when I confronted her. I thought Zach would get it. I mean, cheating is cheating, right? Instead, he leaned back in the booth and let out this long sigh, like I'd just told him his favorite team lost the playoffs. "Dad, come on," he said. "Are you sure you're not blowing this out of proportion? Maybe you two just need counseling or something." "Blowing it out of proportion?" I repeated. "She's been seeing this guy for almost a year. It's not a misunderstanding. It's over." Zach didn't look convinced. "Yeah, but Mom's been a stay-at-home mom for years. Don't you think maybe she felt, I don't know, stuck? Lonely? You've been working a lot, and maybe she just needed... She needed to cheat on me?" I cut in. "If she felt stuck or lonely, she could have talked to me. She didn't. She chose to sneak around instead." Zach shrugged, like it wasn't a big deal. "I'm just saying, maybe you shouldn't rush into divorce. You've been married for 25 years. That's worth something, isn't it?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I sat there, stunned, while Zach went on about how divorce would complicate things and how I needed to think about what it would do to the family. Not once did he say Carly was in the wrong. Not once did he say he understood where I was coming from. By the time I left the diner, it was clear Zach wasn't on my side. I thought Emily might be different, but I was wrong about that too. When I told Emily, her reaction was even colder. We met at a park near her apartment, and I walked her through what happened. She didn't even blink. "Okay," she said when I finished. "So what are you going to do?" "I've already filed for divorce," I said. She crossed her arms and frowned. "Isn't that a little drastic? I mean, Mom made a mistake, sure, but are you seriously just giving up on your marriage?" "She didn't make a mistake, Emily. She made a choice," I said, trying not to sound as frustrated as I felt. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or saying something hurtful in a fight. This is something else entirely." Emily shook her head. "You don't get it. Mom gave up everything for us. Her career, her independence. She put it all on hold to raise me and Zach while you worked. Don't you think maybe that took a toll on her? Maybe she just needed..." "To cheat on me?" I interrupted. "Why does everyone keep acting like this is my fault?" "Nobody's saying it's your fault," Emily shot back. "I'm just saying it's not black and white. People aren't perfect, Dad. Mom made a mistake, but that doesn't mean you should throw away 25 years of marriage." It was like talking to a wall. No matter what I said, Emily kept coming back to how much Carly had sacrificed for the family, and how I needed to think about the bigger picture. When I told her it wasn't up for debate, she got defensive. "Well, if you're set on this, don't expect me to take sides," she said. "I'm not asking you to take sides," I said, though I was starting to realize that was exactly what she'd already done. By the end of the conversation, I was exhausted. Zach and Emily weren't just unsupportive, they were outright dismissive of everything I'd been through. It felt like they were more concerned about Carly's feelings than mine, like her betrayal was somehow justified because she'd been lonely or sacrificed too much. And the worst thing is that Carly didn't even care. Over the next few weeks, things got even worse. Zach and Emily started pulling away. They'd always been good about calling or texting every now and then, but now I was lucky to hear from them once a month. When I tried to check in, the conversations were short and awkward. I could tell they were spending more time with Carly and Rick. I'd see pictures on Facebook, family dinners, birthday parties, holidays, and I wasn't in any of them. They didn't outright cut me off, but the message was clear. I wasn't part of their inner circle anymore. The final blow hit me a few months after the divorce was finalized. Emily called me out of nowhere to share some news. She'd gotten engaged. For a brief moment, I felt like I was part of her life again. My little girl was getting married, and she actually thought to call me. I congratulated her, my voice cracking a little as I told her how happy I was for her. But when I asked about the wedding, there was a pause on the line, and in that split second, I knew something was wrong. Well, Mom and Rick will be there, and Rick will be walking me down the aisle, she said quietly. Like that explained everything. I frowned, confused. So? So it'd be awkward if you came? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. I froze. Awkward? Awkward for who? I wanted to scream. My daughter was telling me, point blank, that I wasn't welcome at her wedding because it might ruffle Carly and Rick's feathers. The guy Carly cheated with, the one who wrecked our family, had a spot at her wedding and will be walking her down the aisle. But her own father is not even invited. You're serious? I asked, my throat tight. It's just, you know how things are, she said, sounding uncomfortable but not sorry. It'll be easier this way. Easier. For who? Definitely not for me. I sat there gripping the phone, trying to hold it together. All right, I said finally, because what else could I say? That was it. I wasn't invited to my own daughter's wedding. I sat there gripping the phone, trying to hold it together. My chest felt heavy, like someone had punched a hole through it and left nothing but air. And just when I thought it couldn't hurt more, Zach followed suit a few months later. His excuse was almost identical. Mom and Rick will be there. You won't be comfortable if you come. Hearing it from him was like a knife twisting in my chest. Zach had always been the one I thought I could reason with, the one who'd eventually understand. But no, he'd made his choice too. At that moment, I realized I hadn't just lost my wife. I'd lost my kids too. Carly hadn't just cheated on me, moved on with that rich guy, and managed to pull Zach and Emily into her corner and shut me out completely. It felt like she'd won. Like she'd taken everything from me and left me standing in the wreckage of a life I'd spent decades building. But I couldn't just let it go. I kept trying. I'd send Zach and Emily texts, leave voicemails. Just checking in, I'd say. Hope you're doing well. Sometimes they'd reply with short, polite messages, 1 or 2 words at most. But more often than not, my messages went unanswered. There was one night, about 9 months after the divorce, when I was feeling especially lonely. The house was too quiet, and I hadn't spoken to anyone in days outside of work. On a whim, I called Zach. When he picked up, I could hear the faint sound of a TV in the background. Hey, Zach, I said, trying to sound upbeat. I was just thinking, why don't you and your fiancé come over for dinner one night this week? It's been a while, and I'd love to catch up. There was a long pause on his end. Then he sighed. I'd like to, Dad, but we're super busy right now. Wedding planning, you know? Maybe some other time. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced a smile he couldn't see. Sure, I get it. Another time. Yeah, for sure, he said. I'll call you when things settle down. He didn't call. That was the moment it fully sank in. I wasn't a priority in their lives anymore. I was just an obligation they'd occasionally remember when it was convenient. The hope I'd been holding on to started to fade, little by little. I tried to convince myself that it was better this way, that staying in a marriage where I wasn't respected would have been worse. But there was always this gnawing voice in the back of my head, wondering if I'd made the wrong choice. Should I have fought harder? Should I have swallowed my pride and stuck it out for the sake of the family? I never got an answer. Life just moved on without me. I spent the next 8 years keeping my head down and throwing myself into work. Honestly, it wasn't because I loved my job. It was more about survival. I was 50 years old, starting over, and I needed something to keep me going, and work was all I had. My job in IT wasn't thrilling, but it paid the bills and kept me busy. Most days, I'd bury myself in fixing network issues or helping coworkers with tech problems. It was the kind of work that didn't require much emotional investment, which was exactly what I needed at the time. Then Martin came along. He was one of those guys who was always thinking 10 steps ahead, the kind of coworker who'd pitch ideas at the break room coffee machine like he was on Shark Tank. One day, he pulled me aside and said, "You ever think about doing your own thing? Starting something from scratch?" At first, I laughed it off. "Martin, I'm not exactly a risk taker," I told him. But he kept pushing. His idea was to launch a tech consulting firm that specialized in cybersecurity. He said there was a growing demand for it, and that we could really make a name for ourselves if we played it right. The more he talked, the more it made sense. I had the technical know-how, and he had the business savvy. After weeks of late-night conversations over greasy takeout, I finally agreed to give it a shot. "What have I got to lose?" I told him. The first couple of years were brutal. We worked insane hours, juggling our day jobs while trying to build the business on the side. There were nights when I'd fall asleep at my desk. We hit roadblocks left and right, clients backing out, budget problems, and more stress than I'd ever dealt with before. But we kept at it. Slowly, things started to click. We landed a few big contracts, built a reputation for delivering results, and eventually, the business took off. By the time I hit 58, I was doing better than I ever had. I wasn't rich by any means, but I was comfortable for the first time in my life. I'd moved out of that depressing apartment and into a modest but cozy house with a yard, and I was proud of it. I'd even managed to build a little savings, something I'd never thought I'd have after the divorce wiped me out. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my life. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. I kept to myself for the most part, focusing on work and keeping my personal life simple. I started dating, and then I met Lena. She was a widow. Her husband died in car accident 2 years ago, and we clicked right away. She was amazing. And after 1 year, we got married. We had a beautiful girl, and we named her Sarah. My life was quiet, and I liked it that way. Then, out of nowhere, Zach and Emily showed up at my door. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the middle of mowing the lawn when I saw their car pull into my driveway. At first, I thought I was seeing things. I hadn't seen either of them in years, and now here they were, stepping out of the car like nothing had happened. I killed the mower and walked over, not sure what to expect. "Dad!" Emily said, smiling like we'd just spoken yesterday. Zach was right behind her, holding a toddler I assumed was his kid. For a moment, I felt this flicker of hope. Maybe they were here to reconnect, to finally mend the gap that had grown between us. "It's been too long," Emily said, giving me a quick hug. "Yeah, it has," I replied, still trying to process what was happening. We stood there in awkward silence for a few seconds, before Zach cleared his throat. "Mind if we come in?" "Of course," I said, stepping aside. They walked in like they owned the place, commenting on the house, how nice it was, how much I'd really come up in the world. I didn't pick up on the vibe then, but I was too caught up in the moment. We sat in the living room, and I couldn't help but notice how overly friendly they were being. Zach asked about work, Emily complimented the house, and they both kept throwing in little comments about how much they'd missed me. Then, after about 20 minutes of small talk, the real reason they were here came out. "Dad," Zach started, leaning forward, "we need to ask you something." "Sure," I said, still oblivious. He glanced at Emily, who gave him a nod, and then he said it. "We could really use your help, financially." I just stared at them, waiting for some kind of explanation. Emily jumped in. "It's not for us exactly. It's for the kids. We've had some tough times lately." Turns out Rick's landscaping business had taken a nosedive, and both Zach and Emily had been working for him. Now that the money was drying up, they were struggling to make ends meet. "So, what are you asking?" I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "Well," Emily said, "we thought maybe you could help us out a little. You know, just until we get back on our feet." That flicker of hope I'd felt earlier? Gone. They didn't come to reconnect. They didn't come because they missed me or wanted to make things right. They came because they'd heard I was doing well, and now they wanted a piece of it. "I'll think about it," I said, keeping my face neutral. They left soon after, thanking me like I'd already agreed to bail them out. The second they were gone, I sat down and blocked their numbers. 8 years of silence, and this is why they came back? It wasn't about family. It wasn't about healing old wounds. It was about money. For years, I'd dreamed of a moment where they'd come back into my life, where we'd sit down, have an honest conversation, and rebuild what we'd lost. But now I realized that was never going to happen. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. They weren't done yet. A week later, they showed up at my office, unannounced and completely uninvited. I was in the middle of a meeting with a client when my assistant knocked on the door and said, there are 2 people in the lobby who say they need to see you. They didn't have an appointment." Tell them to leave their names and I'll get back to them, I said, annoyed. She hesitated. They're saying they're your kids. My stomach dropped. Of course, it was Zach and Emily. I told her to ask them to wait, figuring I'd deal with them after the meeting. But apparently, patience wasn't in their vocabulary. Not 5 minutes later, I heard voices down the hall. They'd pushed past the assistant and walked straight into the conference room, dragging their kids with them. Dad, we need to talk, Zach said, completely ignoring the fact that I was sitting at a table with 2 clients and my business partner. I stood up, trying to keep my composure. I'm in the middle of something, I said. This can't wait, Emily said, planting herself at the head of the table like she owned the place. I glanced at Martin, who looked as confused as I felt, and then turned back to them. Fine. Wait in my office. I'll be there when I'm done. Zach opened his mouth to argue, but Emily grabbed his arm and dragged him out, muttering something under her breath. I apologized to the clients, wrapped up the meeting as quickly as possible, and headed to my office, already dreading what was waiting for me. When I walked in, Zach was pacing the room while Emily sat on the couch, bouncing a fussy toddler on her lap. Neither of them looked happy. You've got some nerve, Zach said, as soon as the door closed. I raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? Blocking us? Ignoring our calls? He snapped. We're your family, Dad. You don't just shut us out like that. I leaned against the desk, crossing my arms. Funny, that's exactly what you did to me for 8 years. Or did you forget about that? Emily sighed, clearly trying to play mediator. Look, we get it, okay? We screwed up. But we're trying to fix things. That's why we came here today. No, you're here because I wouldn't hand over money, I said. It's not about the money, Zach said, his voice rising. It's about the kids. They deserve to know their grandfather. I glanced at the toddler squirming on Emily's lap. I didn't even know his name. They'd kept me out of their lives for years, and now, suddenly, I was supposed to play the doting grandpa. I've never even met them until today, I said, keeping my voice steady. You've spent years shutting me out, and now you're dragging them here to guilt me into helping you? That's low, even for you. Zach's face turned red. You're unbelievable. Do you even hear yourself? You're punishing us for making a mistake, and the only people you're hurting are those kids. You mean the kids you didn't let me meet for 8 years? I shot back. The toddler started crying, probably sensing the tension, and Emily immediately jumped up to soothe him. Can we all just calm down? She said, her voice strained. But Zach wasn't calming down. He was getting angrier by the second. You're acting like a bitter old man, he spat. Do you even care about anyone but yourself? That was it. I'd had enough. I stood up straight and pointed to the door. Get out, now. Zach looked like he was about to argue, but Emily grabbed his arm again. Let's go, she said through gritted teeth, her face pale. They left, but not before Zach turned back and hissed, You're going to regret this. When you're old and alone, don't come crying to us. The door slammed behind them, and I just stood there, shaking with anger. I'd been holding on to some small hope that maybe, deep down, they still cared about me. But now I realized the truth. They didn't care about fixing our relationship. They cared about what I could do for them. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but my mind kept replaying the scene in my office. The audacity of them barging in like that, acting like I owed them something, it was almost laughable. A few days later, they took it a step further. This time, it was an email. The subject line was, Let's start fresh. I opened it, more out of curiosity than anything else. It was a long, overly wordy apology. They admitted they'd messed up, said they regretted shutting me out, and claimed they wanted to make things right. But buried halfway through the email was the real reason they were reaching out. We've been working on a new business idea, it said. It would mean the world to us if you could invest in it. We're not asking for a handout, just a little help to get started. I didn't even finish reading. I slammed the laptop shut and stared at the wall, trying to keep my temper in check. They hadn't changed. They didn't care about reconnecting. They didn't care about me. All they wanted was my money. I didn't respond. This time, I didn't even bother pretending to think about it. I was done. I made the decision to cut them off completely. After their constant demands and manipulations, it was clear Zach and Emily weren't interested in fixing anything. They just wanted what I could give them. I blocked their numbers, removed them from every social media account, and even changed my email address. I wasn't going to leave any door open for them to use me again. At first, I felt a twinge of guilt. Cutting off my own kids felt drastic, but it wasn't like they'd left me with much choice. For 8 years, they had no problem keeping me out of their lives. Now, they could stay out of mine. It wasn't easy. There were moments where I questioned myself. What kind of father cuts off his kids? But every time I thought about letting them back in, I remembered how they'd treated me. Not just recently, but for years. The silent birthdays. The weddings I wasn't invited to. The way they only came around when they needed something. They didn't want a father. They wanted a resource. So I moved forward. I threw myself into work, took up new hobbies, and even started traveling a little. I made peace with the fact that my family wasn't coming back. It was freeing in a way to stop waiting for something that was never going to happen. Then, out of nowhere, Carly showed up. It was a Saturday morning, and I was just finishing my coffee when I heard the knock at the door. When I opened it, there she was, my ex-wife, standing on the porch looking nothing like the confident woman she'd been when she left me for Rick. She looked old, tired, worn down. Her clothes were faded, and there was a desperation in her eyes I hadn't seen before. "Carly," I said, my voice flat. "What do you want?" She hesitated. "Can I come in?" "No," I said, crossing my arms. "Say what you need to say." She swallowed hard, glancing at the ground. "Rick's gone," she said quietly. "His business went under and he left." I raised an eyebrow. "Left? As in he just took off?" She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "He drained everything we had and disappeared. I have nothing, no one to turn to. I didn't know where else to go." I leaned against the doorframe, trying to process what she was saying. The man she left me for, the man who was supposed to give her the better life she'd always wanted, had bankrupted her and walked away. "What exactly are you hoping to get from me?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice cracking. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I was selfish and stupid. And I see that now. I threw away the best thing I ever had for someone who didn't care about me." Her words hung in the air, but they didn't hit me the way they might have years ago. I didn't feel angry or vindicated. I just felt nothing. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally, "but it doesn't change anything. You made your choice, Carly. You walked away, and now you're dealing with the consequences. That's not my problem anymore." Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't waver. I'd spent too many years letting people walk all over me, and I wasn't about to let her back in just because she was desperate. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I needed to tell you. I needed you to know how sorry I am." I nodded once, stepping back into the house. "I hope you figure things out, Carly, but this is where we leave it." And with that, I closed the door. After she left, I sat down in my quiet house, feeling a strange mix of emotions. It wasn't satisfaction or triumph. It was closure. For the first time, I felt like I could finally let go of everything. The marriage, the betrayal, the pain, it was all behind me now. I've spent the past few months focusing on myself, my wife and my little daughter, my work, my hobbies, my peace. I don't look back anymore. Cutting ties with Zach and Emily wasn't easy, but it was the right choice for me. As for Carly, her apology didn't change the past, but it gave me the final push I needed to move forward. I've made peace with the fact that my life doesn't look the way I thought it would, but it's mine, and I'm finally at a place where that's enough.